Hello and welcome back. This week we are going to be talking about bodies, which for many people, even though talking about sexuality may be uncomfortable, talking about bodies can be even more uncomfortable. And we often have a lot of emotions and feelings and judgments wrapped up in our own bodies. So I just want to remind all of us to treat ourselves and one another kindly this week as we dive into the often messy but very interesting world of thinking about bodies in terms of sex and sexuality. So, of course, this is a sociology class. So when we talk about bodies, we're not just going to be talking about biology. And while biology is very important, it is not entirely self-evident. So as a sociologist, we think that biology, the actual physical body itself, the biological knowledge we have about bodies, may provide some of the data, the facts about what a body is or what it can or cannot do. But society really provides the meaning for that data. So what do bodies mean? How do we engage with them? How do we engage in our own body? How do we feel about them? And how do they sort of act as a repository for social norms or identity or other aspects of living in society with other people. And David Halperin, who is an academic who studies sexuality, he's actually an English professor, talks about this very memorably, and he once said, there is no orgasm without ideology. So even this, like what we think of as a very basic biological function of orgasming, there's so much meaning loaded into that that we can't separate from society and societal norms. So that's all just another way of saying that the biology that we have, we are bodies, we have bodies, is always experienced and understood through the lens of the social. And so one of the sort of relevant questions for thinking about bodies and sexuality is to really think about what a sexual body looks like. So when we imagine a body that is sexual or perhaps sexy, what does that look like in our cultural understanding? So we have all of these cultural scripts about what bodies are considered sexual and which are presumed to maybe hypersexual or too sexual or asexual or not sexual enough. And we might think about what those bodies look like in terms of their size, ability or disability, age, might even think about other intersecting identities like race or class when we think about the cultural scripts about what bodies are considered appropriately sexual or sexual at all, and what bodies are considered maybe too sexual or not sexual enough. We can also think about the way that quote-unquote normal sexual activity is one indicator that a body is able or is not broken or is well in some way. And the flip side of that understanding is that part of having a quote-unquote normal body is that you have a body that is sexual. And so that sort of implies that people who are not sexual, either by choice or by orientation or by circumstance, are somehow abnormal. So again, thinking about the ways in which our social norms and understanding are constantly moving in and impacting our meaning about things like bodies. When we think about bodies, we also think about, in terms of sexuality, the centricity or the central role that genitals play. So genitals are often seen as the primary and sometimes the only part of the body that is sexual, or at least the most important sexual body part, although we can think about a lot of other body parts as being sexual as well. Some people argue that the skin is the largest sexual organ in, or I guess on the body, and that physical touch can be very important for sexuality. Also think about phallocentrism as a key concept when we're thinking about bodies and sexuality, the idea that our current understanding of sexuality is very focused not just on genitals, but on penises or male genitals in particular. And as an example of that, if you think back to the first or second week where we looked at the questionnaire and the data about how people defined sex, so many of those behaviors were linked to penises, right? Penile-vaginal intercourse, penile-anal intercourse, whether or not there was an ejaculation, right? So the idea that penises and male sexuality are often central to our understanding of what sexual bodies look like. We can also think about the way in which compulsory or presumed heterosexuality plays in this. Often when we think about genitals, we're thinking about penis and vagina and not two penises or two vaginas or some other combination. And the idea that folks are presumed heterosexual until proven otherwise, right? The idea of coming out. Folks who are heterosexual generally don't need to come out, but that also heterosexuality is what you are socialized into. It is compulsory. It's required in order to be in a privileged position in society in many ways. And when we're focusing on biology, we're often end up focusing on the mechanics of sexuality. And so what are some of the consequences of that? How do we link body parts like a penis to understandings of gender? So the way that biological sex often presumes a gender identity. So we presume that people with penises grow up to identify as men and people with vaginas will grow up to identify as women. And when we focus on the mechanics or the body parts of sexuality, how does that close off some understandings of what sexuality might look like, but how does it also open up some ways to think about sexuality that are maybe linked to body parts and various behaviors as opposed to a specific identity or something like that. And the last thing to think about is when we're so focused on genitals and biology when thinking about sexuality, we're often very orgasmocentric or sort of centralizing orgasm as both an indication of good sex, like did somebody come, was it good, but also as the ultimate end or the completion, like a sexual act or activity or encounter is complete if somebody orgasmed, right? We think about, we'll talk about in pornography, like the money shot is usually, the male ejaculation is usually the end of whatever video or act, if that, presuming there is a man involved somewhere. One couple other concepts I also want to talk about is framing for how we think about bodies, thinking about stigma and shame and guilt. So guilt being the idea or the perception that, like, I did a bad thing. I did a thing that was not good or was not ethical or whatever. It was not in line with whatever value. Whereas shame is really thinking about, I am a bad person, right? So if we think about the concept in context of sexuality, perhaps I had sex with someone and I had told myself that I was not going to have sex with that person for whatever reason. And so feeling of guilt would say, like, oh, I did a bad thing by having sex with that person, whereas shame response would be, I'm a bad person because I had sex with that person. And stigma is a social response to identities or characteristics. And this is a concept that comes from Irving Goffman. So a stigma is an attribute, behavior, or reputation that is socially discrediting in some way. So that might be the fact that you have sex, you might be stigmatized for that. The fact that you are of a particular sexual orientation, you might be stigmatized for that. Or you might just have a behavior for being a particular type of sexual person and be stigmatized for that. But whatever it is, it causes the person or the group to be classified by others in the group or in the society as undesirable in some way. And so as a result, they are often ostracized or devalued or shunned. And so while guilt and shame are individual reactions, like I can feel guilty or I can feel ashamed, stigma is the social dynamic of being socially marginalized or ostracized based on that. And that's not to say folks might not try to induce guilt or shame in a person, those can also be social encounters, but stigma is the social response and the way that a person or a group of persons is stigmatized or is ostracized or othered and devalued in a social context. So just some questions to think about. How does shame about bodies impact our own engagement or understanding of sexuality? And how does sexual stigma interact with shame around sexuality? And so thinking about the way that guilt, shame, and stigma are present or are impacting our understanding or our ability to move through the world as we think about bodies and sexuality. So, a question just for you to reflect on, to think about what kind of body work do you do in the course of your normal everyday to day life? So, body work could be something as sort of quote unquote basic as showering most days and brushing your teeth, although that is also socially contextual. Showering daily is not a thing that has always been thought of as good or healthy or normal, or at least prevalent. But for many of us, this body work is much more extensive. So another way of asking this question is, what kind of work do you do to manage your body to make it more socially acceptable, either to mainstream society or to various subgroup norms? So some examples of things from my own life. I pluck my eyebrows. I spend a fair amount of time on eyebrow maintenance, actually. I go to the gym and I work out, and I try to make sure that I have a body that is not only healthy, but also that is fit and attractive. I shave. I shave my face sometimes, but I generally don't shave my legs. That may be different for you depending on your gender or your experience or how much you care. But there's lots of things that we do to our bodies to make them fit social norms or to not fit social norms. And so body work evolves with social norms and expectations around things like beauty and gender expression, sexual expression, as well as the expectations of different social communities you might belong to based on class, race, region, profession, age, a hobby or interest that you have. And so those expectations about bodies and what body work you do are also going to be contextual on the different social locations that you inhabit. So I want to think for a minute about men's bodies or male bodies, and we're going to think a little bit more in terms of binary sex / binary gender for the moment, although trans and non-binary folks are certainly not immune to nor excluded from these social perceptions or assumptions or scripts about bodies. But for a moment, we'll just sort of sit in this binary space, even though I know that's not entirely complete or doesn't apply to everyone. So thinking about concepts of broken male machines and men's bodies using this mechanical metaphor of a machine, and thinking about how this ties to masculinity as something that someone who is competent, who's in control, that there's flawless performance, and the way in which men's bodies are medicalized. And so the idea of medicalization being the increased treatment of something that's previously considered non-medical problem with medicines or with hospitals or doctors or professionals. So for an example, Viagra, right, a prescription drug as a treatment for what is usually just a natural change in sexual function as we age. And whereas that used to not be a medical problem, people got older, their sexual function shifted and changed as they aged, now is something to be treated with a pill. And so also thinking around some of the social expectations of sexual performance for men that are tied into male understandings of male sexuality, but also the presumption that male sexuality is very obvious, it's straightforward, it's simple, right? The penis is erect or it's not erect, which is a simplification of the various things that men's bodies do in terms of sexuality and sexual arousal. And so how can we reframe some of these social scripts around men's bodies or sexual performance? Can we reframe the stigma around not being able to get an erection on demand or in terms of a sexual performance? And then, of course, thinking about intersectionality, the way in which our understandings or scripts around men's bodies are deeply intertwined with presumptions often of heterosexuality and the link between heterosexual performance and masculinity, the way that age and masculinity can intersect in our understandings, and definitely about how race and masculinity shapes our perception or our scripts around not only men's bodies, but around men's sexual performance and the expectations there, and the way that Black men in particular are often hypersexualized and become the objects of fear, and the way that these narratives are linked to like biologically grounded racism, the perception that Black men's bodies are inherently different than white men's bodies, that they are less evolved, which of course is biologically factually incorrect, but also a social mechanism for marginalizing Black people in general, but Black men as well in specific here. So we've talked about men's bodies a little bit. We'll talk about female bodies or women's bodies, and again, sort of holding aside the fact that this is not going to be inclusive of everyone for the moment. But thinking about the different ways that women's bodies are also medicalized. And just as a reminder, medicalization being that treatment of previously non-medical problems with medicines or hospitals, doctors. And this idea that women's bodies and sexuality are often sort of up for debate or discovery, quotes there, by male professionals, male doctors. So thinking about like the male doctor who discovered, quote unquote, the G-spot. We talk about men who have discovered the clitoris, whereas women have known about these things, / women's bodies have been like that long before men sort of discovered them. And the sort of different metaphors or perceptions that we have to and use for thinking about women's sexuality. The idea that in contrast to men's sexuality, women's sexuality is complicated, or it's mystifying, or it's elusive, not just to men, but also to women themselves. And we use lots of natural metaphors about plants and about gardens and about fruit when we're thinking about women's bodies as well. And thinking about the sexuality and sort of social and cultural narratives, and some might say obsession around biological phenomenon like the G-spot or female orgasm or female ejaculation. The way that fertility and childbirth has been highly medicalized, and so you sort of have to have a baby in a hospital, whereas women were having babies long before hospitals even existed, and they will continue to do so. And the way that women of color and other non-Western women's bodies are often exoticized and seen as mystical and sexual, or having these elusive powers in some way. We can also think about the way that body work is often so much more central to women's daily experience and to their lives and how they're perceived, and the way that double standards around beauty and desire and pleasure, and the ways that those things play into how much body work women are often feel required to do socially to be able to fit in. Again, thinking about the way that presumed heterosexuality, or the presumption of sexuality, heterosexuality plays into this, and the just extreme level of non-surgical body modifications in addition to surgical options that women often engage with, and how this differs in body work in terms of men and women is a question we might think about, and what are the consequences of that. And just thinking about some of the non-surgical body modifications that are available. This one is a fad that I don't really think caught on, but was a thing that sort of came up as a trend in women's body work. And so, this concept, some of you may have heard of vajazzling, and so here's an example of what that might look like. To think about just some of the lengths that women go to or are encouraged to go to, with the presumption to, sort of come surprise him, come in and let us vajazzle you, the presumption of heterosexuality, and that women's bodies are sort of there for men's sexual pleasure rather than their own, although certainly women might engage in body work for their own pleasure or feelings of empowerment, that so often the capitalization, the monetization of this is framed in a form of compulsory heterosexuality. So that's it for this lecture. We'll see you next time. Have a great week.